March the 16th, 1943, North Atlantic, west of Ireland. 2:41 hours, 30 meters down, a steel boat moves at 2 knots on electric motors. A radio man tilts his head. The commander watches the clock. Then it comes through the hull, high and thin, ping, in a second, precisely spaced. The sound runs through steel into teeth. The hull gives a small tremor. Iron cannot hide in water. ASDIC has found them. The interval is steady, the range closing. Protocol, rig for silent running, shut non-essentials, slow pumps. The spacing sets range. The steadiness has a trained crew. Bearing barely shifts. Contact holds. Air, batteries, and depth are finite. Choice is narrow. The boat eases 1 degree to port. The navigator times the pings and writes a crude range. The engineer watches battery draw. Above, a destroyer measures them with patience. He orders 5 degrees down bubble, then cancels. Depth is no refuge here. The commander closes his eyes. Nights on the surface are gone. A ship above is listening by speaking. The ocean has turned from cover to stage. They are no longer hunters. They are being found. This moment exists because 2 wars have been running through each other for years. One of ships and steel, and another of schedules and factories. In the early days of the Atlantic War, German commanders measured the ocean and found it sheltering. Convoys gathered in places a dozen U-boats could use to compose new shapes. Through 1940 and into 1941, in what U-boat men later called the happy time, submarines rose at night, charged batteries under stars, and drove into the columns of ships with guns and torpedoes because darkness was a weapon. British sets called ASDIC, active sonar that put energy into the sea and listened for it to return, were good for hunting submerged boats after an attack, but they did not see boats on the surface in the night. The ocean belonged to the quiet. All of that began to come apart after 1942 in a series of ways that U-boat crews experienced as a single change in the weather. Very long-range aircraft and escort carriers stepped out into the air gap where convoys had been naked. Radar moved down in wavelength into bands that could not be heard by early German detectors. The lee light turned night into a hammer driven by sudden daylight. Direction-finding antennas on the escort's masts learned to hear the shape of a transmission and tell a destroyer what bearing to run on. And under it all was the sound, the ping, carried by mass-produced sets into the hulls of escort ships and destroyer escorts in numbers that would have seemed waste in 1940 and felt like a minimum by 1943. On the U-boat corridors, expectation was consistent until it wasn't. A surfaced U-boat received contact reports, swung into the shadow wind of a convoy, and sent a torpedo into a ship. The expectation was that a convoy would panic. The experience by 1943 was something else. Corvettes and destroyers moving like hands over a chessboard in prearranged shapes steered by men with headphones. A glow in the sky becoming a burning daylight. A bearing shouted from an HF/DF set, whose dial knew where a U-boat had just pushed a message onto the air. Above a submerged boat, the destroyer keeps a rhythm that feels like something a man learned as a child. Ping, pause, ping, pause. The distance between these sounds is the only measure of safety a man inside the boat will get. The U-boat's passive ears, the hydrophones, hear screws somewhere above, and count the blades and try to decide whether a ship is escort or merchant. This information used to buy maneuvering room. Now the ping says that the boat is a traced object in a volume where he cannot kill the man who is killing him. The commander calls for silence, which is a formal word for a set of things not possible inside a hungry cylinder. Air circulators cut, pumps quieted, a man's throat telling itself not to clear. Valves asked to not chatter, a boat praying to not breathe. The enemy's methodical, relentless search turns the hunter into a cornered animal, held in place by an invisible acoustic leash. There is a chart of numbers for these nights that settles arguments as harshly as the ping itself. In 1942, The tonnage German submarines sank reached peaks that seemed to obey the arithmetic of total war: 6 million gross registered tons. Then the ratio's other half moved. Coastal Command's Liberators flew long enough into the mid-Atlantic that the gap closed. RAF scientists brought 10-centimeter radar into the world. Hedgehog forward-throwing projectors came to the bows of escorts with spigots angled to place 24 small bombs into an oval ahead of a ship. They would not detonate unless they struck your hull. The old way, depth charges tumbled off racks, roared, raised a cloud of bubbles, blinded the escort's ears, allowed men below to live on margin. The new way was quieter and crueler. The ping would continue. The escort would not drive over you. It would throw its bombs where you were going to be. You would hear no consolation until one of the Hedgehog heads touched the steel around you and went off like a door slamming inside a cathedral. May 1943 is a calendar month. It is also a proper noun. Black May. 41 U-boats sunk. More than a quarter of the force at sea lost in that one menu of days and nights. BDU signals to the fleet changed their tone from exhortation to caution. Enemies intercepting the traffic in Bletchley Park heard a weather report that sounded like an obituary. Dönitz himself, blunt and loyal and committed to his men's iron courage, looked at the graph and withdrew his boats from the North Atlantic convoy lanes in late spring. He did not say, "The U-boat war is over." He said that the boats must be husbanded and fitted with new tools, and that conditions were not in our favor. Men who were not asked to speak publicly wrote the truth in private. The hunters had been made into quarry by a system that did not tire. When U-boat men later gave accounts, they described the ping as a presence. The ASDIC impulses drummed into the hull, one officer remembered. It is a sound that takes up residence in a man, and each ping is a command. Depth charge patterns felt like arithmetic, and men found the ratios they could tolerate. The creeping attack used by British support groups under Captain Johnny Walker represented a different insult to their nerves. One destroyer would fix the target with ASDIC and keep pinging, while the second worked in more quietly from another bearing, with engines and sonar reduced. The U-boat heard a chorus at once. The main ping of the ship that talked and the pursuing silent intention of the one that did not. The second ship fired Hedgehog where mathematics and experience said the U-boat now existed. In such attacks, Hedgehog could kill with an efficiency that degraded the defensive impulses learned with depth charges. Go fast, go deep, use the wash. There was no wash. There was the sound of your own breathing and the noise inside your skull. Air changed everything. In 1942, a U-boat commander could surface into dark and trust the hour between a sighting and a destroyer's arrival. By mid-1943, an airplane could detect a periscope's feather. 10-centimeter radar saw mass at ranges that made men doubt their instruments. The lee light turned black water into a stage for a second in which a pilot could place his depth charges in a line so close you could read them as handwriting. Men inside boats came to fear the moment a peaceful dark got halved by white. Later that year, a new, smaller sound joined the ping, the splash of something dropped by an aircraft that then did not detonate. This was Fido, the Mark 24 mine, a small air-dropped passive acoustic weapon that listened for the submarine's noisy decision to give itself speed and follow the sound of the propellers. The U-boat could try silence, which sometimes worked if it accepted a different kind of death. Or it could run, and the thing in the water would follow. German engineers did not stop thinking. The snorkel was a machine's shy admission that the surface had become a place where the enemy owned your minutes. A boat could draw air underwater and cruise at periscope depth. The Allied General accepted the peace. Adoptability answered it brutally by changing methods again. The Germans produced their own acoustic homing torpedoes, Soundkönig G7ES. Escorts answered with a metal box, Foxer, that screamed in the water with a sound more delicious to the homing head than screws in bought space. None of these changes meant Allied men were safe. Convoys were hit and burned in 1943 and 1944. But the system, this word matters as much as the ping, had the advantage now, and systems speak in numbers and in repeated shapes made out of work. The symbol for this system is that single sound. It is not a lyric noise. It is an industrial courtesy. Ping. A democracy's abundance has to have a sound in war. This one is more useful than poetry and more honest than speeches. It is the sound of a schedule. The men inside boats wrote different sorts of chains. A helmsman made a chain of pings into a sense of whether the pinging ship had his place or his last place. A chief listened to the batteries and made the boat's endurance into a number he kept in his head. The commander touched piping for heat and asked a man to look at the periscope and tell him if there was a shape up in the light. The time between pings gets tight in the Minutemen right about later. The escorts cross overhead, and the U-boat is pressed into its own weight by overpressure from charges. Oil seeps into the sump. A gasket extrudes. Pipes make noises they will not confess to later. The ping continues, sometimes with a new partner. Hedgehog strikes are not big, they are personal. Men write about hearing metal flatten. They write about a bolt on a panel jumping under the strain. In later years, many say that the ping is the thing they hear in dreams. Not the rush of water, not a big bang, but that thin, polite tapping that goes on until someone else decides it will stop. American ships joined the small ships of other flags in 1943. Not born to the work, men who built Liberty ships at speeds that made riveters laugh learned to assemble Buckley-class destroyer escorts like recipes. In short sprints over big water, slow, steady tens of hulls did their answers. British names and American numbers met near the mid-Atlantic ridge and set the job. Get the convoy through, listen, ping, kill. Beneath that were logbook lines. Fix at 600 yards. Lost in wake, regained at 800. Hedgehog unsuccessful, no explosions. And the heavier ones, oil and debris, strong smell, wood, life jackets, all hands believe lost. By late 1943, the graph tilted. Merchant losses per month fell. U-boat losses rose. The lines crossed and did not reverse. Convoys closed. Escorts fanned. HF/DF and radar tightened the net. Under those lines mattered one sound, the ping, the calculated note that linked ships, aircraft, operators, and targets. If the story must close its circle, hold both moments. The one in March 1943 when the boat was caught by a sound, and the one years later in a museum. At the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, a U-boat sits under soft light. A guide will say something true. Systems were made of men, and men made sounds into safety. In another museum, a console waits with a dial where ears once rested. Press a button and hear it. Ping. Children laugh. The sound is small. An old man hears it and smells oil in a place he thought he left. German U-boat men did not deserve to hate that note as much as they did. They were brave. All who met the sound speak of it as people do when struggling to despise what saved others. A democracy that guards a sea uses patience, steel, and schedule. Across the North Atlantic in 1943, a sound belonged to the system. Ping. It was abundance made audible, steady, precise, and unafraid.